Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Today we're going to do another episode of the Memory Lane series, the place where we take a look back at some interesting articles and interviews from old guitar magazines. So my dad has been subscribed to Guitar World magazine for about 30 years now. He saved a bunch of old magazines. He was kind enough to let me borrow some. So the one we're going to look at this time is the February 1993 issue of Guitar World magazine. Here's the cover. The article we're going to talk about was written by Nick Kent about Syd Barrett, one of the original founding members of the legendary Pink Floyd. The guy who lost his marbles. He had to leave the band in 1968. Even though Syd was only directly responsible for Pink Floyd's first album, their debut album, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, he contributed a little bit to their second album as well, Saucerful of Secrets. He was still indirectly responsible for the rest of the albums that followed. His essence never left them. He was still with them. His spirit influenced everything that the other members of Pink Floyd did. They never forgot about Syd. So this article will examine his life before Pink Floyd, during Pink Floyd, and after Pink Floyd. Give you a glimpse inside his twisted world. Try to explore what went wrong with Syd. What contributed to his downfall. What was the culprit. What caused him to go insane. This is a pretty long article, so I'm going to try to get through this quickly. Here we go. At the outset of one of Syd Barrett's final gigs with the Pink Floyd, the band took the stage without Syd. The guitarist was back in the dressing room, maniacally trying to organize his anarchically inclined hairstyle. As his comrades were tuning up, Barrett, more out of desperation than anything else, emptied the contents of a jar of Mandrex Quaaludes, broke the pills into tiny pieces, and mixed the crumbs in with the full jar of Brill cream. He then poured the whole coagulated mess onto his head, picked up his Telecaster, and walked on stage. As he was playing his customary, incoherent, sporadic, almost catatonic guitar phrases, the intense heat of the stage lighting began having a predictable effect on the Mandrex Brill cream. The concoction dribbled down from his scalp, turning his face into a distorted wax of flesh. This story is probably true. It is one of an infinity of strange tales, many of them, in fact, just as many wistful fiction, that comprise the Syd Barrett legend. Every so often, Barrett, who is still alive and basically functioning, appears at Lupus Music, the London publishing company that handles his royalties and which has kept him financially afloat these last few dormant years. The rest of Barrett's time is spent either sprawled out in front of a large color TV in his two-room Chelsea apartment, or else just walking randomly around London. He was recently spotted in a King's Road clothes store, where he tried on 3 vastly different sizes of the same style of trousers, pronounced all of them a perfect fit, and then disappeared again without making a purchase. And that is basically what the Syd Barrett story is all about. A huge tragedy shot through with so many ludicrously comical aspects that one could easily compose an entire article simply by relating all the crazy anecdotes and half-chewed tales of his twilight dementia. The inescapable truth, however, goes far beyond the utterly bogus image of the artist as an acid casualty. Syd Barrett was a brilliant, innovative young songwriter whose genius was somehow amputated, leaving him in a lonely limbo of helpless, illogical schizophrenia. The whole saga began with a band called the Abdabs. They were also called the T-Set. No one quite knows which came first. The band was a 5-piece, as it happens, consisting of 3 young, aspiring architects, Richard Wright, Nick Mason, and Roger Waters, a jazz guitarist called Bob Close, and the youngest member, an art student named Roger Keith Syd Barrett. Storm Thorgerson, a fellow townsman of the guitarist, and one half of Hypnosis, the company that designed all of Pink Floyd's album sleeves, remembers Barrett as a bright, extroverted kid. smoked dope, pulled chicks, the usual thing. He had no problems on the surface. He was no introvert as far as I could see. But Barrett was far more complex than this recollection indicates. The guitarist had three deeply felt interests: music, painting, and religion. A number of Barrett's seniors at Cambridge University were dabblers in an obscure form of Eastern mysticism known as Sant Saji, which involved heavy bouts of meditation and much contemplation on purity and the inner light. Syd attempted to join the Sant Saji faithful, but was turned down for being, at 19, too young. According to a number of those who knew him, this rejection affected him quite deeply. In any case, Barrett lost all interest in spiritualism soon thereafter. He subsequently gave up his painting, a pursuit in which, according to Dave Gilmour and Thogerson, he'd shown exceptional potential. Syd was a great artist, said Gilmour. I loved his work, but he just stopped. First it was the religion, then the painting. He was starting to shut himself off slowly then. His interest in music, of course, continued. The Abdabs eventually evolved into the Pink Floyd sound, which was really just the old band, but minus Bob Close, who never quite fit in. The source of the band's unusual name was Syd, who was inspired by a blues record he owned that featured Pink Anderson and Floyd Council, two guitarists from Georgia. While the band name flowed easily from the lips, the band itself was none too inspiring. Their repertoire included no original material, consisting instead of tunes like Louie Louie and Roadrunner, both of which the early Floyd personalized by interspersing liberal dosages of scatico freakout, a form of psychedelic jamming. For all their limitations, the band managed to attract some professional interest in their future. Peter Jenner, a lecturer at the London School of Economics, and John Hopkins, a part-time magazine publisher, were in the audience for one of the Pink Floyd gigs, and were impressed enough to offer them some sort of management deal. Admits Jenner, it was one of the first rock events I'd seen. I didn't know anything about rock, really. Actually, the Floyd then were barely semi-pro standard, now that I think about it, but I was so impressed by the electric guitar sound. The band was just at the point of breaking up, you know. It was weird. They just thought, oh well, might as well pack it all in, but they changed their minds. One of Jenner's first acts as a manager was to build an elaborate light show around the band's performance. The next was to install a policy of playing only original compositions. This was where Syd Barrett came into his own. Barrett had at this point composed only a few odd tunes, a nonsense song called Effervescing Elephant, for example, written when he was perhaps 16, and he'd set a James Joyce poem called Golden Hair to music, but nothing beyond that. Jenner. Syd was really amazing, though. I mean, his inventiveness was quite astounding. All those songs from that whole Pink Floyd phase were written in no more than 6 months. He just started and took it from there. The first manifestations of Barrett's songwriting talents was a bizarre little classic called Arnold Lane, which dealt with the twilight wanderings of a transvestite/pervert figure. A sinister piece of vaguely commercial fare, it is both whimsical and singularly creepy. The single was banned by Radio London, who found its general concoctions a little too odd for even pirate radio stations. The Floyd were, by now, big stuff in swinging London. Viewed from hindsight, the band came on just like naive art students in bird-style granny glasses. The first publicity shots are particularly laughable, but the music somehow had an edge. And the Barrett guitar style? Jenner said, well, he had this technique that I found very pleasing. I mean, he was no guitar hero, never remotely in the class of Page or Clapton, say. The Floyd cult grew as Barrett began to hit his creative stride. His songwriting can only be described as a happy marriage of the two ideal forms of English psychedelia: musical rocko freakouts and a particularly English style of whimsy, of the kind associated with Limerick master Edward Lear and the man who created Alice in Wonderland, Lewis Carroll. Pink Floyd's debut, Piper at the Gates of Dawn, 1967, was recorded at the same time as the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's and the two bands occasionally met up to check out each other's product. Paul McCartney even stepped sorry guys. Paul McCartney even stepped out to bestow his papal blessing on Piper, an album which still stands as one of the best musical memories of 1967, except for Bike, which reeks of crazy basements and psychedelic whimsy, taken a little too close to the edge. Strange things were starting to happen with the Floyd, and particularly with Barrett. Their first single, See Emily Play, was top 5, which enabled Barrett to more than adequately live out his pop star infatuation number of the hilt. The Hendrix curls, caftans, and Fender Telecasters were all his for the asking. The ego problems and slight tantrums were the first signs that anything was seriously wrong with Barrett, and gradually the Floyd, Jenner, and others in his circle realized that something deeper was going on. Take the Floyd's 3 appearances on Top of the Pops, a popular British music show. Jenner said the first time Syd was on Top of the Pops, he dressed up like a pop star. The second time he came on in his straightforward, fairly scruffy clothes, looking rather unshaven. The third time he came to the studio in his pop star clothes, and then changed into complete rags for the actual TV spot. It all had something to do with the fact that sometime earlier, John Lennon had stated publicly that he wouldn't appear on Top of the Pops. Syd seemed to regard Lennon as some sort of yardstick by which to measure his own situation as a pop star. Syd was always complaining that John Lennon owned a house while he only had a flat, states Peter Barnes, but there were far darker hints of a definitive impending imbalance in the Barrett psyche. He was at that point involved in a relationship with a girl named Lindsay. The affair took an uncomfortably bizarre turn when the lady appeared on Peter Jenner's doorstep fairly savagely beaten up. I couldn't believe it at the time. I had this firm picture of Syd as this really gentle guy, which is what he was, basically. Something was definitely awry. In fact, there were numerous fairly unpleasant tales about this particular affair, including one where Barrett locked the girl in a room for a solid week, pushing water biscuits under the door so she wouldn't starve, which are best not dwelt on. Syd's eyes often cemented themselves into a stare that really frightened all who stood in his presence. The head would tilt back slightly, the eyes would get misty and bloated, then they would stare right at you and right through you at the same time. One thing was painfully obvious. The boy genius was fast becoming completely unhinged mentally. Perhaps it was the drugs. Barrett's intake at the time was fearsome by any standard, and many considered his constitution to be a trifle fragile for such chemicals. The combination of such circumstances can, of course, lead to a certain degree of brain damage, but to truly understand the Barrett psyche, one must traverse more Freudian landscape. Many of the people familiar with Syd claim that his breakdown must be linked to specific traumas. Barrett, the youngest of 8 children, was 12 years old when his father died abruptly. The impact of this severe loss was compounded by his strong-willed mother, who spoiled Syd mightily. Everyone is supposed to have fun when they're young. I don't know why, but I never did, Syd Barrett said in an interview with Rolling Stone in autumn 1971. Peter Jenner said, I think we tended to underrate the extent of his problem. I mean, I thought that I could act as a mediator, having been a sociology teacher at the LSE and all that stuff. I think, though, one thing I regret now was that I made demands on Syd. He'd written See Emily Play, and suddenly everything had to be seen in commercial terms. I think we may have pressured him into a state of paranoia about having to come up with another hit single. Barrett's fragile psyche began to truly unravel when the Floyd were forced to appear on some American TV shows. Dick Clark's Bandstand was disastrous because it required a lip-singing job on the band's part, and Syd wasn't into moving his lips that day. I'm gonna get a drink real quick because my throat's getting dry from reading all these words. That's better. Forgive me for stumbling over these huge words they like to use. The Pat Boone show was quite surreal. Boone actually tried to interview Barrett on the screen, asking him particularly inane questions and getting a truly classic catatonic, piercing mute stare for an answer. By the time the band returned to Britain, they had reached a decision. While Barrett was the Floyd's songwriter and central figure, his madness had become far too much to handle. He just couldn't be communicated with. Their patience had not been rewarded, and so the breakaway was in the cards, but not before a final studio session took place, a mad, anarchic affair which spawned 3 of Barrett's truly vital twilight rantings. Unfortunately, only one has ever been released. Jug Band Blues, the only Barrett track that made it onto the band's second album, Saucerful of Secrets, from 1968. It is as good an explanation as any for Syd's absence from the rest of the album. You see, even at that point, Syd actually knew what was happening to him, claims Jenner. I mean, Jug Band Blues is the ultimate self-diagnosis on a state of schizophrenia. It's awfully considerate of you to think of me here, and I'm almost obliged to you for making it clear that I'm not here, and I'm wondering who could be writing this song. Barrett actually had a Salvation Army band troupe in during the middle of the number. The 2 unreleased songs, these contrary to popular belief, are the only unreleased numbers Barrett has ever recorded, are both unfinished creations. Scream Your Last Scream is a masterful splurge of blood-curdling lunacy. Scream your last scream, old woman with a basket, wave your arms madly, madly. Flat tops of houses, houses, mouses, shall be scrubbing apples on all floors. Middle D Tittle with dumpy Miss D will be watching telly for all hours. Also unreleased is Vegetable Man, a demented sing-along tune. Syd, recalls Jenner, was around at my house just before he had to go to record, and because the song was needed, he just wrote a description of what he was wearing at the time and threw in a chorus that went, "Vegetable Man, where are you?" A nationwide tour of Great Britain followed. Jimi Hendrix, The Move, The Nice, and Floyd all in one package. Syd often wouldn't turn up on time, and occasionally didn't play at all. Sometimes he sat by himself on the tour coach. The rest of the Floyd socialized with The Nice. Guitarist David O. List played with the band when Barrett was indisposed. But surely the 2 uncrowned kings of acid rock, Hendrix and Barrett, must have gotten along famously. Not really, says Jenner. Hendrix had his own limousine. Syd didn't really talk to anyone. I mean, by now he was going on stage and playing one chord throughout the set. He was into this thing of total anarchistic experiment, and never really considered the other members of the band. Enter Dave Gilmour, who was an old mate of Syd's and a pretty fair guitarist, not long back from working with various groups in France. The implications were obvious. The Floyd played maybe 4 gigs with the 5-piece, and then Barrett was out. Everyone seemed to agree that it was all perfectly warranted, except maybe Syd. From here on in, the whole Barrett saga goes a trifle haywire. The Madcap Lapse from 1974, Barrett's first solo album, took a laborious year to complete. Production credits constantly changed hands, from Peter Jenner to Malcolm Jones, who gave up halfway through, and ultimately to Dave Gilmour and Roger Waters. By this time, Barrett's creative processes refused to mesh properly, and so the results of his efforts were often jagged and unapproachable. Basically, they were essays in distance, of which Barrett waved whimsically out from the haze. Or perhaps he was drowning. On Dark Globe, the anguish is all too real. My head kissed the ground. I was half the way down. Please lift a hand. I'm only a person. With Eskimo chain, I tattooed my brain all the way. Would you miss me? Oh, wouldn't you miss me at all? Many of the tracks, though, like Terrapin, practically just lay there on the ground, scratching themselves. They exist completely inside their own zone, like weird insects and exotic fish, with the listener forced to look inside the tank for an activity. In many ways, Madcap is a work of genius. In just as many other ways, it's a cranked-up post-acid curio. And for both those reasons, it remains a vital, thoroughly unique album. Storm Thorgerson said, "The thing was that all those guys had to cope with Syd out of his head on Mandrex half the time. He got so mandied up on those sessions, his hand would slip the strings and he'd fall off the stool." Barrett, his second solo album, was recorded in a much shorter space of time. Dave Gilmour was called in to produce, and he brought in Rick Wright and Humble Pie drummer Jerry Shirley to help. Gilmour said, "We had basically three alternatives at that point. Working with Syd, one, we could actually work with him in the studio playing along as he put down his tracks, which was almost impossible, though we succeeded on Gilla Joe Ant. The second was to lay down some kind of track before and then have him play over it. The third was to have him put his basic ideas down with just guitars and vocals, after which we would try and make something out of it. It was mostly a case of me saying, 'Well, what have you got then, Syd?' and he'd search around and eventually work something out. The Barrett disintegration process continued throughout this album, giving it a feel more like that of a one-off demo than a finished product. The songs, though totally off the wall and often vague creations, are shot through with the occasional sustained glimpse of Barrett's lyricism at its most vivid. Witness rats, rats, rats / lay down flat. We don't need you. We act like cats. If you think you're unloved, well, we know about that. Dominoes is probably the album's most arresting track, as well as being the only real indication of what the Floyd might have sounded like had Barrett been more in control of himself. The song is exquisite, painting a classic kind of Lewis Carroll scenario that spirals up and almost defines time and space. You and I and dominoes, a day goes by, before drifting into an archetypical Floyd minor chord refrain straight out of Gilmour. The song just ended after Syd had finished singing. I wanted a gradual fade, so I added that section myself. I played drums on that, by the way. Gilmour had, by this point, become perhaps the only person around who could communicate with Barrett. "Oh, I don't think anyone can communicate with Syd," he says. "I did those albums because I liked the songs. Not, as I suppose some might think, because I felt guilty about taking his place in the Floyd. I was concerned that he wouldn't fall completely apart. The final remix on Madcap was all mine as well." In between the two solo albums for EMI, a bunch of press interviews had been arranged for Barrett, whose controversial style was scarcely suited to the needs of the media. Most couldn't make any sense whatsoever of his verbal ramblings. Others reached their own conclusions and warily pinpointed that Barrett malady in their pieces. One man who interviewed Syd at the time was Peter Barnes. "It was fairly ludicrous on the surface," says Barnes. "I mean, you just had to go along with it all. You know, Syd would say something completely crazy one minute, like, 'It's getting heavy, isn't it?' And you just have to say, 'Yeah, Syd, it's getting heavy,' and the conversation would dwell on that for 5 minutes. Actually, listening to the tape afterwards, you could work out that there was some kind of logic there, except that Syd would suddenly be answering a question you asked him 10 minutes ago, while you were off on a different topic completely." Barrett, by this time, was well slumped into his real twilight period, living in the cellar of his mother's house in Cambridge, and this is where the story becomes singularly depressing. As a Barrett interview with Rolling Stone for Christmas of 1971 showed him to be living out his life with a certain whimsical self-reliance. At one point in the rap, he stated, "I'm really totally together. I even think I should be." Almost exactly a year later, Barrett went temporarily haywire from the sheer frustration of his own inertia and smashed his head through the basement ceiling. Between the interview and the head-smashing incident, Syd went into the studios to record. "It was an abortion," claims Barnes. "He just kept overdubbing guitar part on guitar part until it was just a total chaotic mess. He also wouldn't show anyone his lyrics. I fear, actually, because he hadn't written any." Jenner was also present. "It was horribly frustrating because there were sporadic glimpses of the old Syd coming through, and then it would all get horribly distorted again. Nothing remains from the sessions." And then there was Stars, a band formed by Twink, ex-drummer of Tomorrow, Pretty Things, and Pink Fairies. Twink was another native of Cambridge, had previously known Barrett marginally well, and somehow dragged the Madcap into forming a band that included himself and a bass player called Jack Monk. It is fairly strongly considered that Barrett was used his legendary reputation on hand solely to enhance what was in effect a shambling mediocre rock band. The main Stars gig was held at the Corn Exchange in Cambridge, where they were second billed to the MC5. It was an exercise in total musical untogetherness, and after an hour or so, Barrett unplugged his guitar and sauntered off the stage to return once again to his basement. Since that time, Syd Barrett may or may not have worked in a factory for a week or so, worked as a gardener, tried to enroll as an architectural student, grown mushrooms in his basement, been a tramp, spent 2 weeks busking in New York, tried to become a Pink Floyd roadie. The sources for all of the above are semi-authentic, but it is more than likely that most of the stories are utter fabrications. One thing, though, appears to be clear. Syd Barrett is unable to write songs. In the meantime, Barrett has become perhaps the leading Mysterio figure in all of rockdom. In America, his cult appeal is such that Capitol Records are finally releasing the 2 Barrett solo albums in a double package entitled Syd Barrett 1974. And in countries as diverse as France and Japan, Barrett is a subject of fanatical interest. Finally, there is the Britain-based Syd Barrett International Appreciation Society, which issues a magazine, t-shirts, and buttons. Unfortunately, it's as trivial as it is fanatical. I mentioned the society to Syd once as Peter Barnes. He just said it was okay, he's not really interested in any of it. It's ironic, I suppose. He's much bigger now as the silent cult figure, doing nothing, than he was when he was functioning. Dave Gilmour has the last word. I don't know what Syd thinks or how he thinks. Sure, I'd be going back into the studio with him, but I'm not into projects like that anyway, period. I last saw him around Christmas in Harrods, a London department store. We just said hi, Syd was a strange guy, even back in Cambridge. In my opinion, it's a family situation that's at the root of it all. His father's death affected him very heavily, and his mother always pampered him, made him out to be a genius of sorts. I remember I really started to get worried when I went along to the session for See Emily Play. He was strange even then. That stare, Yeah, it was fairly obvious that I was brought in to take over for him, at least on stage. It was impossible to gauge his feelings about it. I don't think Syd has opinions as such. He functions on a totally different plane of logic, and some people will claim, well, yeah, man, he's on a higher cosmic level. But basically, there's something drastically wrong. It wasn't just the drugs. We'd both done acid before the whole Floyd thing. It's a mental foible which grew out of proportion. I remember all sorts of strange things happening. At one point, he was wearing lipstick, dressing in high heels, and believing he had homosexual tendencies. We all felt he should have gone to see a psychiatrist, though someone in fact played an interview he did to R.D. Lang, and Lang claimed he was incurable. What can you do, We did a couple of songs for Umanga, the live tracks. We used Jug Band Blues for no ulterior motive. It was just a good song. I mean, that nice pair collection will see him doing all right for a couple of years, which postpones the Day of Judgment. I don't know, maybe if he was left to his own devices, he might just get it together. But it is a tragedy, a great tragedy, because the guy was an innovator, one of the 3 or 4 greats along with Dylan. I know, though, that something is wrong, because Syd isn't happy, and that really is the criteria, isn't it? But then, it's all part of being a legend in your own lifetime. So, that's the end of the lengthy article. Hope you guys learned something, diving into the perspective of Syd Barrett's life. He was a pretty fascinating character, wasn't he? It's a shame that his life went so out of control. He was never able to bounce back. His condition just kept getting worse. You can only wonder what would have happened if Pink Floyd still had Syd Barrett, if he was able to continue being part of the band. They might have become even bigger than they are now. Even though Syd lost his mind when his mental state was still intact, like the article said, he was a true genius when it came to writing songs. So, I pray he's at peace now. So that does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Until then, rock on.